The Ukraine counteroffensive to regain territories is going slower than expected. That, as some analysts say, this conflict could last decades. We will be talking with one of those analysts on the show tonight. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. This is not like a Hollywood movie. That's how Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy described the counteroffensive to repel Russian forces. He was alluding to the fact that results don't come quickly. In the meantime, the European Union has introduced another package of sanctions against Moscow. We begin with this report from Dasha Chernyshova in the Russian capital.
In response to the new EU sanctions package, Moscow expanded the list of representatives of European institutions and EU member states who are banned from entering the Russian Federation. The Russian Foreign Ministry says they include the representatives of law enforcement agencies, governments and commercial organizations and citizens involved in providing military assistance to Kiev. The ministry stresses that unilateral sanctions by EU countries are illegitimate and warns that Moscow will respond timely and adequately to any unfriendly actions from the West. On Friday, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergiy said Moscow would not reveal the number of nuclear warheads it is deploying in Belarus. Both Moscow and Minsk have confirmed that Belarus has started to receive Russia's tactical nuclear weapons. Ryabkov also noted that Kiev's so-called Jet coalition is looking for ways to inflict maximum damage on Russia, and that it is part of what Moscow sees as a Western hybrid war against Russia. The diplomat said Western training programs for Ukrainian pilots will not yield the desired results. Separately, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, traveled to Russia's westernmost city of Kaliningrad for talks on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. In a statement following the talks with the chief executive of the Russian state nuclear energy firm Rosatom, Alexei Likhachev, Moscow called on the IAEA to ensure Ukraine does not shell the power plant. The Kremlin also rejected accusations that Russia was destabilizing Africa, saying Moscow was developing constructive relations with African countries. Dasha Chernyshova, CGTN, Moscow.
Okay, to continue our conversation, let's bring in our panelists. From Newbury in England, General Sir Richard Barrons is a former commander of UK's Joint Forces Command and co-chairman of Universal Defence and Security Solutions. From Providence, Rhode Island, we're joined by Vladimir Golstein, who is chair of the Department of Slavic Studies at Brown University. Sergiy Kudelia is an associate professor of political science at Baylor University. He joins us from Dallas. And from Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a journalist and political analyst. Welcome to all of you. Richard, let me start with you. It's been difficult to get a clear picture of what battlefield conditions are like in this conflict. That's because it's very dangerous to report from the front lines. Now, you've served in the military in command positions. What is your professional assessment from what you see and what you hear about the status of this conflict?
So I think the big dimensions of the fight in 2023 are now pretty clear. The Russian occupation of somewhere around 50% of Ukraine has now had time to be well prepared from a defensive perspective, and it's going to present a much harder fight for Ukraine than the Ukrainian offensive encountered last summer and into the autumn. And from a Ukrainian perspective, they've had time, with a lot of help from NATO, to build quite a large offensive force of, say, around 50,000 people, with 9 brigades worth of NATO equipment and 3 brigades worth of Russian equipment. So we know now that that force is going to be pretty competent, but it's going to be difficult to batter its way through these quite well-structured Russian defenses. And even if it succeeds in doing that, it will never be big enough to throw Russia out of Ukraine in 2023.
Dmitry Babich, what is the assessment of the conflict from the Russian point of view?
Well, let me remind you that everyone was mistaken on Ukraine. I mean, the West predicted that the Ukrainian army would collapse in a few weeks, maybe days, when the Russian attack started in February last year. That didn't happen. The West predicted that there would be a huge guerrilla fight in the rear of the Russian army. It didn't happen. Also, the West predicted that Russia would crumble under the sanctions, the unprecedented sanctions that were imposed. That also didn't happen. So if Russia was mistaken in some of its predictions, and I think the main expectation was that Ukraine would have a strong pro-Russian movement inside the country that would facilitate the actions of the Russian troops. They would not be so bloody and so heavy of consequences for both Ukraine and Russia. Everyone was in error. In the same way here, I think that Sir Richard is right that Russian defense will withstand the current onslaught of the Ukrainian troops. I think the idea, which was very popular in the West, that somehow Zelensky's troops would be able to reach up to Crimea and maybe even to take Crimea, that was a very adventurous approach. I think the solution is, of course, some kind of peace negotiation, some kind of a compromise. But unfortunately, I think the main force that doesn't want a compromise, that is, the Western community of nations, I'm sorry, and Zelensky as the representative of Western influence in Ukraine. As for Russia, the expectation that it would be destabilized, again, the West was in error because they expected some kind of a liberal, anti-Putin and anti-patriotic rebellion. What is going on now is a small caricature of rebellion from Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is actually, I think, imitating in many ways the Russian generals in 1917, who voted against the Tsar, on what they called patriotic grounds.
Okay, Dmitry, I want to get back to Prigozhin a little bit later in the show, but Richard, just one military point before we move on, and that is, as both you and Dmitry have said, that the Russians seem pretty well dug in to withstand any kind of onslaught from the Ukrainian side. So given that, what do you expect to happen next?
It's
Okay, I think we've lost Richard there for the moment. We'll get back to him. Let me go to Sergiy Kudelia. Sergiy, President Zelenskyy said the counteroffensive has been slower than desired, and he said Russian mines are slowing Ukrainian advances. He also pointed out that some people think this is a Hollywood movie, that there's going to be an ending very soon to this, and people are looking for results right now. What is your view of what's going on?
Well, my view is that the battlefield dynamics is only one part of the larger picture, and we should take into account other elements, political, diplomatic elements, and efforts coming from the West in order to support Ukraine. And these are very significant. So what we've seen over the last couple of days in London, there was a big conference of donors from the Western nations, which the European Union committed itself to support Ukraine for the next 5 years with the amount of at least $50 billion for the reconstruction effort of Ukraine. We also are seeing statements coming from Western leaders with regard to the eventual membership of Ukraine in NATO, and a number of leaders of Western nations openly now call on NATO to admit Ukraine into this alliance. We also seen over the last year that Ukrainian army, remember Putin said that he will demilitarize Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army at this point is stronger than it was ever in the history of Ukrainian independence. It's armed with advanced weaponry. It has a very high morale. It's growing, and we see that more efficient military units that are being trained by the Western instructors are joining army units. And most of the most capable units have not been part of the battle just yet. So what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 weeks was the probing operations from different sides, from different points, where the Ukrainian army is trying to identify the weak spots of the Russian defenses in order to concentrate their larger scale operations in these areas. And that's why what Zelenskyy is suggesting, the president of Ukraine, is that we need to expect a longer term battles that would be coming in the future once these weaknesses are identified. And of course, a very important element of the whole picture is what's happening inside Russia. And over the last couple of hours especially, we've seen very important developments in Russia that suggest that there may be a split within the Russian elites and that a number of top brass Russian generals are really nervous about the possibility of a civil war. And in fact, the top military intelligence officer in Russia has just publicly said that there is a possibility of the civil war in Russia. So what Dmitry Babich calls a caricature, in fact, is very seriously treated by the top Russian leaders.
All right, I will get a response from Dmitry Babich on that in a moment, but first I want to go to Vladimir Golstein. Vladimir, what is your response to what Sergiy Kudelia just told us about the fact that the EU is promising more money for Ukraine, $50 billion more? The Europeans are now holding out hope that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and that the country is now better equipped, better trained than it has ever been in its history.
Well, you know, they, as an army, they might have good soldiers, those who survived and those who made it. But I hope that NATO, not just leadership, but common people know that all their money are going to the slaughter. You know, no matter who, from what side you look at it, Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers, they are being slaughtered. And Sergiy said that, you know, good soldiers are, well-trained soldiers are not sent to the battle. Who is sent to the battle? Young kids from all over Ukraine, which are being butchered. You know, we saw the pictures of the tanks. You know, you think if the tanks are bombed down, can you imagine what's happened with infantry? This is just, you know, a continuation, escalation, throwing of good money after bad money, and sooner or later the West have to come back to the senses and realize that Russia in this situation can't afford to lose. If worst comes to worst, they can use, and they will use, tactical nuclear arms. And furthermore, whatever civil war occurs there, whoever takes over will be actually coming from the right, as more patriotic, as more nationalistic, as more militant. So this is a naive hope to imagine that Russia will crumble. In fact, whatever will happen, it will be more aggressive, more, more in your face. And, you know, why is it all happening? Furthermore, you know, in terms of waiting for them, okay, Russians can wait. Sooner or later, I think Americans will come back to their senses too. There'll be election. Biden, who is just pushing this war for various reasons, he's probably not, because some of his advisors push him there, will be voted out of the office or be brought out of the office, whatever the shape he'll be. Maybe he won't be even able to walk out of his office, and then we'll see what will happen. But for the time being, it's a waste of life, waste of resources.
Yeah, let me get back to Richard. Richard, great to have you back with us. You know, we've been talking about some of the politics of this conflict, but there's just one military point, and that is, as you mentioned earlier, the Russians are pretty well dug in on along their defensive line to withstand any kind of counteroffensive from the Ukrainians. So given that situation, where do you expect the conflict to go to from here? I mean, is it just going to be in a situation of stalemate for the months ahead?
So we know right now that Russia has constructed a military textbook defense, and the early encounters with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is really only in its early stages so far, have established that it's robust and it's well protected by minefields and artillery, and plenty of people are defending. It is not proven yet whether Ukraine will or will not find a way to grind its way through or outmaneuver it during the course of the summer, and that's what everyone, I think, is having a look for now. I think the point is that no matter how successful the Ukrainian counteroffensive is during the course of this year, at its most successful, it will make a serious dent into the Russian occupation of Ukraine, but it won't conclude it. And so we are all faced with the prospect of this war very likely spilling on into future years. And the big decisions will be taken in Western capitals about the industrial mobilization that's necessary to support Ukraine if they want this war to continue. And that, I think, is where the debate will go.
Dmitry, I want to get to those points that Sergiy Kudelia made earlier on, that there appears to be a split among elites in Russia, and that he referred to it as the possibility of a civil war in the country. What do you say to that?
Well, I think a civil war is very unlikely, and I agree with what Vladimir has just said. I think it's an irony of history. For years, and especially in the last few months, the Western media has been demonizing Yevgeny Prigozhin as someone very bad, very bloodthirsty, even more nationalistic than Putin. And now I expect him actually to be arrested, and I expect the Western media to say that, oh, this is the alternative. This is the man who challenged Putin. And they will quickly forget, as the Western media usually does, what they have been saying just recently. The problem is that the Western media is misrepresenting public opinion in Russia. If you listen to Western media, almost all of the people are against the actions of the government. They dismiss this military operation as senseless. In reality, a huge chunk of Russian public opinion speaks for more active military operations in Ukraine. It supports strikes against targets inside Ukraine, such as bridges or maybe the headquarters of Ukrainian military. A lot of people and a lot of media outlets are also speaking out in favor of, for example, striking the airfields in Poland and other nearby countries from where the Ukrainian army is getting its arms. So basically, if there is a split in the Russian leadership, it will happen in the way that Vladimir has just described. It will be more nationalistic, more militaristic people trying to challenge Putin.
Okay.
And that just shows the incompetence of the Western elites, which have been presenting Putin as some sort of new Hitler who is the worst among Russian politicians. No, Putin has been behaving as a liberal during most of his rule. And he tried to postpone this military operation as long as it was possible. People just forget that for 8 years, there was a civil war in Ukraine with thousands of people dead.
All right, Dmitry, I want to get...
This is how the Russian public opinion perceives it.
All right, I want to get to Sergiy Kudelia. Sergiy, you wrote a piece on the Al Jazeera website, which was entitled, What Will It Take to End the War in Ukraine? So give us the main points of those proposals that you laid out.
Well, the essence of the piece is that, unfortunately, based on the positions of the warring sides of Russia and Ukraine, and of course the West is part of it, there will be a very low likelihood of a negotiated solution in the nearest future, primarily because there is a dispute about the extent to which one or the other side can defeat the other convincingly. And we are seeing that the forthcoming offensive that just started a couple of weeks ago is one way to measure the extent to which Ukraine, with the help of the West, is capable of pushing Russian forces out. But as long as we rely only on military dynamics or dimension of the conflict, I think, just as the other speaker mentioned, it will take a long time for us to see the possible outcome, primarily because...
Sergiy, let me just stop you there. If you say it's unlikely that there would be a diplomatic solution to this conflict, what would a battlefield outcome look like?
Well, there are a couple of outcomes, of course. The most likely one is that we are going to see at some point a stalemate where the Ukrainian forces will be able to push Russians out of some territories, but they will stop at a certain line. And that stalemate, to some extent, will determine the likelihood of further negotiations. But that will also depend on the dynamics in Moscow, in the Kremlin, among the political leadership, just as we discussed.
Right.
Because if political leadership in Russia crumbles or it falls into the mutual recriminations, and if there is mass desertion from the battlefield, as Prigozhin calls on, if there is mutiny on the Russian, within the Russian army, then we are going to see a very different outcome as scenario.
Vladimir Golstein, there was yet another peace proposal announced in Moscow this past week. This one was led by an African delegation, 3 African countries. It was at one of those meetings that President Putin produced the text of a peace deal initialed by Ukrainian officials. That peace deal was drawn up last year, towards the beginning of last year, and Russia in the peace deal had agreed to withdraw to its positions on February 23rd, but that deal was killed by the West, specifically the United Kingdom Prime Minister Boris Johnson. What do we know about that? What happened?
Well, every time Russians say something, the West dismisses it as propaganda, as war offensive, as hybridization or weaponization or whatever new terms they come up with. But that's the fact that, you know, the people on the ground, they know that their kids are being killed, and they were thinking of negotiating something and settling, you know, as like there's a very good proverb, Russian proverb, maybe in other countries, that bad peace is better than a good war. However, Biden and his advisors, Jake Sullivan and Blinken and Boris Johnson and other hawks, for some reason, they thought they want to fight Russia till the last Ukrainian, and that's what they were told, you know, to Zelenskyy, who became, he started like, you know, a thinking person, but now he acts like total puppet of the West, not quite ready to negotiate on his own. However, there is a pressure, not just on pressure on Russian leadership to solve it, but the pressure on Ukrainian leadership, because a lot of Ukrainians, especially on the eastern side of the country, don't want to fight. They want it to be over, and they will be very happy. You know, on the eastern Ukraine, they'll be very happy to live under Russians as well. Western Ukraine is a different story. Russians will never go there. They understand it. But this is the situation. They need to make peace. And until the West interferes, there'll be grinding and violence and our shows, which is kind of, I guess, that's the way it goes.
Right. Richard, you have talked about this conflict lasting decades. I mean, do you believe that this conflict can and will be resolved on the battlefield? And of course, that raises another point, and that is, I mean, we know that NATO nations have been giving enormous support to Ukraine, money and weapons, logistical support, intelligence support as well. I mean, is that commitment, do you believe, open-ended?
So I think we ought to be clear that most wars don't end in conclusive military victory in the way, for example, that the Second World War did. And so far, this war in Ukraine has shown every sign of a situation where actually at the minute, neither side can win, neither side is going to lose, and neither side is about to give up. So it has some considerable way to go. The key question for Ukraine is, does it continue to have the will to fight, to spend its blood and sweat on fighting the Russian occupation? And to date, that seems to be very, very clear that they do. From the Western perspective, the support so far has very largely been from inventory. It's been from things that were held on the shelf or were relatively easy to give. What comes next, if this war is to continue, would be the mobilization of Western defense industry, because that is the only way that the numbers of Ukrainian citizens now in uniform can be supported to fight the war for however long this takes. But it's very hard to predict, given that neither side at the minute thinks they've exhausted the utility of fighting.
You know, it's interesting what you say about Western mobilization, because there was a speech that was made by the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, Christopher Cavoli. He made this speech in January at a defense forum in Sweden, and he said at that time, and just 2 points he made there, he said, the scale of this war is out of proportion with all of our recent thinking. And he also said for decades, NATO's focus was an out-of-area operations such as the war in Afghanistan, while territorial defense fell by the wayside. So does NATO have to play catch up here?
So the Supreme Allied Commander is absolutely right. The Western nations had 30 years of being free from existential peril of thinking there would be a war in Europe, and certainly not a war for territory. And the campaigns in places like in Iraq and Afghanistan had been of a particular type. They never required the mobilization of civil society. So we're at a place where this war has erupted in Ukraine, so far rightly contained to Ukraine, at a time when Western militaries are at the bottom of a trajectory of being made smaller and less ready because there really wasn't any great need, and they are now in recovery mode. And the NATO summit in July of this year is going to take a big step forward in resetting NATO for an era of great power confrontation. But at the heart of this question is, if Ukraine is to be given a chance to fight the war, if it chooses to continue to do that, you can only do it by mobilizing Western defense industry.
Right. Dmitry, I want to get back to the point that Richard just made on the NATO summit that takes place in Vilnius in Lithuania next month in July. The Ukrainian defense minister, talking about that summit, says he expects, and I'm quoting him here, he says he expects to hear a clear signal and formula for Ukraine to become a member of NATO at that summit.
You can also quote President Zelenskyy, who said that the refusal of the West to take Ukraine into NATO, deactivates, demotivates, as he said, the Ukrainian troops. Maybe this is the case, but this is precisely the reason why Russia went to this war. The West, while the West kept saying that we have no plans to take Ukraine into NATO immediately. We all remember that the suggestion came from the United States in 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest. And George Bush, the senior, expected to ram this through right at that summit. So it was only because of Germany and France not being prepared to this move that Ukraine was not invited then. Yes, I think it's a very dangerous development. This is exactly what Russia wanted to avoid. Let me remind you that de facto, Ukraine was becoming a NATO member long before 2022. The so-called training centers, which the British and the Americans established in Ukraine on the Black Sea coast, looked very much like NATO bases. And President Poroshenko said that Ukraine was going to get missiles which could hit Moscow. That was quoted in the Western press. I can send you a number of links. So, of course, this is a very dangerous development. The French, especially, President Macron, is behaving very irresponsibly because he keeps talking about a possible phone conversation with Putin while sending weapons to the Ukrainian troops and while saying that he may invite Ukraine to NATO. That shows how terribly hypocritical Macron is.
Dmitry, I am running out of time. I want to go to Sergiy Kudelia to get his opinion on the Vilnius summit in July. Sergiy, what do you expect to come out of that?
Well, I think it's safe to predict that there will be no open invitation for Ukraine to join NATO anytime soon. But there will be a commitment to continue supporting Ukraine militarily, intelligence sharing and training. And most importantly, there will be some type of formula of security assistance from individual countries. We already hear about some kind of multilateral framework that may emerge from some members of NATO who directly support Ukraine in a more proactive manner.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us on the show. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.